A morning like any other. The city awakened with its usual symphony of sounds, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Marcus Reynolds, a resolute man in his mid-40s, sipped his coffee while flipping through the notes for the day's meeting. As the director of internal affairs for the city's police department, Marcus was no stranger to pressure. His career had been built on exposing corruption and fostering accountability in a system fraught with inequities. But today felt different. There was an air of anticipation as he prepared to unveil a groundbreaking proposal aimed at rooting out systemic bias within the force. He folded the papers neatly into his briefcase and adjusted his navy blue blazer. His reflection in the hallway mirror bore testament to years of dedication. Graying hair at the temples, faint lines etched on his face, and a quiet determination in his eyes. Marcus had spent the better part of 2 decades fighting for justice, but the battles always seemed uphill. Today's meeting with city officials and community leaders was his opportunity to turn the tide. Marcus's sleek black car purred to life as he pulled out of his driveway. He had always favored practicality over extravagance, but his vehicle symbolized his hard-earned success. The city's morning light danced on the hood as he navigated through bustling streets, his mind preoccupied with last-minute tweaks to his presentation. As Marcus entered a neighborhood known for its mix of small businesses and working-class families, a sense of familiarity washed over him. This was where he had grown up, a place of humble beginnings that had shaped his unyielding sense of fairness. He passed the corner where his mother used to buy groceries, the schoolyard where he had played basketball, and the library where he had spent countless hours studying. Lost in thought, Marcus barely noticed the police cruiser pull up behind him, its lights flashing. A sharp blare from the siren brought him back to the present. He glanced in his rearview mirror, perplexed. He hadn't been speeding, and his vehicle was in perfect condition. Why was he being stopped? Pulling to the curb, Marcus took a deep breath. He knew better than to let frustration cloud his judgment. Reaching for his wallet, he prepared his license and registration, then lowered the window as the officer approached. The man in uniform was tall and burly, with a hardened expression that suggested years of street policing. His name had read Officer Grayson. "License and registration," the officer barked without preamble. Marcus handed over the documents, keeping his tone polite. "Good morning, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Grayson's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized Marcus's paperwork. "Just a routine check. Step out of the car." The word sent a ripple of unease through Marcus. He had witnessed countless situations like this, scenarios where a routine stop escalated unnecessarily. Remaining calm, he exited the vehicle, his movements deliberate and measured. "Is there a problem?" Marcus inquired again, his voice steady. Grayson circled the car, his gaze lingering on the polished exterior and the custom plates. "What's a guy like you doing in this part of town? Doesn't seem like you'd have any business here." The insinuation was clear, and it struck a chord. Marcus's mind flashed to the countless cases he had handled involving racial profiling and abuse of authority. Yet he maintained his composure. "I grew up here," he replied simply. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Grayson smirked. "Fancy suit, nice car. Doesn't add up." Marcus felt the weight of the officer's assumptions pressing down on him. He could sense the growing tension, but he refused to let it dominate the situation. "If you'd like, you can run my license and verify my identity." The officer's smirk faded as he walked back to his cruiser, radioing in Marcus's details. Moments stretched into what felt like hours as Marcus stood by the roadside, his heart pounding in his chest. He was acutely aware of the power dynamics at play. To the onlookers passing by, he was just another black man being stopped by the police, a narrative all too familiar. A group of pedestrians slowed, curiosity drawing them to the scene. Among them was a teenager with a smartphone, discreetly recording the encounter. Marcus noticed, but chose not to react. He understood the power of evidence, both as a weapon and a shield. When Grayson returned, his demeanor had not softened. Your vehicle matches the description of one involved in a robbery last week. I'm going to need to search it." Marcus hesitated. He knew his rights, but he also understood the potential consequences of refusing. With a nod, he stepped aside, allowing the officer to proceed. As Grayson rummaged through the car, Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just about him. It was about the larger issue of accountability. The very system he worked to reform was now targeting him, and he could feel the weight of that irony. The crowd of onlookers grew, their murmurs filling the air. The teenager with the phone had moved closer, capturing every detail. Marcus glanced at the boy and offered a faint smile, silently thanking him for bearing witness. Grayson emerged from the vehicle, empty-handed, but no less confrontational. "I'm placing you under arrest," he announced. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Marcus's heart sank, but his expression remained impassive. "On what grounds?" he asked calmly. "Suspicion of involvement in the robbery," Grayson replied curtly. "We'll sort it out at the station." As the cuffs clicked into place, Marcus inhaled deeply, summoning every ounce of restraint. He would not let anger dictate his actions. "I suggest you contact your supervisor," he said firmly. Grayson chuckled. "I don't think that'll be necessary." At that moment, another police car arrived on the scene. The driver, a senior officer with a commanding presence, stepped out, his gaze immediately locking onto Marcus. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a look of disbelief. "Grayson, what the hell are you doing?" the senior officer demanded. Grayson stiffened, confusion etched across his face. "Sir, I'm detaining this man." "Release him. Now." The senior officer's tone brooked no argument. "But, do you have any idea who this is?" The senior officer's voice rose, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "This is Marcus Reynolds, Director of Internal Affairs." Grayson paled, his confidence evaporating in an instant. He fumbled with the handcuffs, releasing Marcus with a mumbled apology. The senior officer turned to Marcus, his expression apologetic. "Director Reynolds, I deeply regret this incident." Marcus adjusted his suit and turned to the crowd, now brimming with curiosity and indignation. He met the eyes of the young man with the phone, giving a subtle nod. "Thank you for documenting this. Accountability starts with visibility." Though shaken, Marcus knew this moment was bigger than himself. As he stepped into the senior officer's car for a ride to his meeting, he resolved to turn this encounter into a catalyst for the reform he had spent his life pursuing. Ripples of the past. The air inside the senior officer's vehicle was heavy with tension. As the car pulled away from the scene, Marcus glanced back at the small crowd still murmuring among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. The young man with the phone stood rooted in place, staring at his screen as he reviewed the footage. Marcus knew the video would soon circulate, drawing attention to what had just transpired. He welcomed it, not for personal vindication, but for the broader message it could send. The senior officer, Captain Elena Monroe, drove in silence for several blocks before speaking. "Marcus, I can't tell you how sorry I am for what just happened. Grayson is, well, you've seen for yourself." Marcus turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "Elena, this isn't about you or me. It's about a system that allows someone like Grayson to operate unchecked. If it wasn't me today, it would have been someone else." Captain Monroe sighed, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I've been trying to address these issues within my precinct, but the culture is so deeply ingrained, it feels like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." Marcus gave a small nod, understanding her frustration all too well. "That's why the reforms I'm proposing today are so critical. This isn't just about training or policies. It's about dismantling the underlying attitudes that fuel this behavior." They pulled into the parking lot of the municipal building, a towering structure of glass and steel that symbolized authority and governance. Before stepping out, Captain Monroe placed a hand on Marcus's arm. "Whatever you need from me after this, you have my support. I'll testify, provide records, whatever it takes." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'll hold you to that." As Marcus entered the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's events were a microcosm of the very problems he was trying to address. His mind flashed back to his childhood in the same neighborhood where he'd been stopped. Back then, encounters with the police had been a rite of passage for young black men. He remembered the summer of his 16th year, when he and his friends were playing basketball at the park, and a squad car pulled up, lights flashing. "Hands up! Let me see your hands," an officer had shouted, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. Confused and terrified, Marcus had complied, his heart pounding as the officers demanded to know what they were doing there. It had taken the intervention of a local community leader to de-escalate the situation, but the humiliation and fear had left a lasting impression. That moment had planted the seed of his eventual career in law enforcement, not out of a desire for revenge, but from a burning need to create change from within. The conference room on the 22nd floor was already buzzing with activity. City officials, community leaders, and senior members of the police department filled the space, their conversations a mix of guarded optimism and skepticism. A large screen displayed a presentation slide titled, "Building Bridges, A Path to Equitable Policing." Marcus took his place at the head of the room, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention. He began his presentation with a series of stark statistics: disproportionate arrest rates, complaints of excessive force, and the pervasive lack of trust between the police and the communities they served. "These numbers aren't just data points," Marcus said, his voice steady but impassioned. "They represent lives disrupted, families torn apart, and communities left in fear. And the burden of these failures doesn't just fall on those directly impacted. It undermines the integrity of our entire justice system." He outlined his proposed reforms, which included mandatory bias training, the establishment of independent oversight committees, and the implementation of body cameras for all officers. But the cornerstone of his plan was a mentorship program pairing senior officers with recruits to foster empathy and understanding. "This isn't about pointing fingers," Marcus continued. "It's about accountability, transparency, and rebuilding the trust that has been eroded over decades." The room fell silent as he concluded, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then one of the city council members, an older man with a salt and pepper beard, leaned forward. "Director Reynolds, your proposal is ambitious, but how do you address the resistance you'll inevitably face from within the force? Many officers feel these measures are an attack on their authority." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Change always meets resistance, but we need to ask ourselves, are we here to serve the public or to protect our own power? The badge is not a shield from accountability. It's a symbol of responsibility. If officers can't embrace that, they have no place in the force." The council member nodded thoughtfully, and a ripple of murmured agreement spread through the room. Marcus could see the cracks forming in the wall of opposition. After the meeting, Marcus returned to his office, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. As he settled into his chair, his phone buzzed with a notification. The video of his encounter with Officer Grayson had gone viral. It had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #PolicyReformNow. He clicked on the video, watching as his own image appeared on the screen, standing calmly as Grayson searched his car. The young man's voice could be heard narrating, "This is what we go through every day. But this time, they messed with the wrong person." The comment section was a mix of outrage and support. Some praised Marcus's composure, while others expressed anger at the systemic issues the video highlighted. Marcus's phone rang. It was Captain Monroe. "Marcus, have you seen the video?" she asked. "I have," he replied. "It's powerful." "There's something you should know," Monroe said, her tone grave. "The department is already under fire for another incident involving Grayson. This video might be the final straw. The chief wants to meet with you tomorrow." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Good. It's time for a reckoning. That evening, Marcus sat on the porch of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His thoughts drifted to the faces of those who had supported him on his journey. His parents, who had instilled in him a deep sense of justice. His wife, who had stood by him through the long nights and tough decisions. And his mentors, who had guided him through the labyrinth of politics and power. The road ahead was daunting, but Marcus knew he wasn't alone. The viral video, the growing support for his reforms, and the dedication of allies like Captain Monroe gave him hope. He resolved to continue the fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or mistreated. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Marcus whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The reckoning begins. The morning sun cast long shadows over the city as Marcus Reynolds arrived at police headquarters. The imposing structure loomed like a fortress, its glass facade reflecting both the hope and the challenges within. The viral video of Marcus's unjust detainment had ignited a storm of public outcry, sparking debates on local news channels and social media platforms. The community's trust in the department, already tenuous, was now hanging by a thread. Inside, the tension was palpable. Officers exchanged furtive glances as Marcus walked through the lobby, his presence a reminder that change was no longer a distant concept, but a looming reality. At the end of the corridor, the conference room doors stood ajar, revealing a cluster of senior officers and administrators waiting inside. Among them was Chief Donovan Carter, a seasoned leader known for his no-nonsense approach. "Marcus," Chief Carter greeted, extending a hand. His face was a mixture of regret and resolve. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Marcus accepted the handshake, though his expression remained unreadable. "Chief, given the circumstances, I wouldn't be anywhere else." The two men entered the room, where Captain Monroe and several other high-ranking officials sat around a long mahogany table. A monitor at one end displayed the now infamous video. Paused on the moment, Marcus stood silently as Officer Grayson rummaged through his car. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Carter cleared his throat. "We're here to address the incident involving Officer Grayson and Director Reynolds. Before we proceed, let me state unequivocally that this department does not condone racial profiling or any form of misconduct." Marcus nodded but said nothing, waiting for the chief to continue. "This situation has escalated rapidly," Carter admitted. "The public response has been overwhelming, and there's mounting pressure for accountability. Captain Monroe has already initiated an internal investigation, but given the severity of the situation, I believe it's time to take more decisive action." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Chief, we've had this conversation before. Investigations are important, but they often serve as a band-aid on a bullet wound. If we're serious about change, we need to go beyond damage control." Carter sighed. "I understand that, Marcus, which is why I want your input on how to handle this situation. What do you suggest?" "The path forward." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "First, Officer Grayson needs to be placed on immediate administrative leave. His behavior in that video demonstrates a clear abuse of power. Second, we need a public-facing response, not just an apology, but a commitment to action." Captain Monroe chimed in. "I agree. Transparency is key here. We need to show the community that we're not just brushing this under the rug." Chief Carter nodded. "And what about long-term measures? How do we prevent something like this from happening again?" Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "This is the proposal I presented to the City Council yesterday. It outlines a comprehensive approach to reform, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and community engagement programs. But the cornerstone is accountability. Officers must understand that their actions have consequences." The room fell silent as the officials reviewed the document. One of the deputy chiefs, an older man with a skeptical expression, finally spoke. "Marcus, I don't disagree with your goals, but implementing these reforms will face significant pushback. The union will fight tooth and nail, and morale within the department could take a hit." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Deputy Chief, morale isn't built on unchecked power. It's built on trust, trust within the department and with the community. If we can't achieve that, then morale is the least of our concerns. The deputy chief shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing further. A voice from the community. As the meeting progressed, Marcus emphasized the importance of involving the community in the reform process. The people we serve need a seat at the table. Without their input, any changes we implement will feel superficial. Chief Carter nodded thoughtfully. You're right. Let's set up a series of town hall meetings to hear directly from the public. We'll also create an advisory board with representatives from the community, including activists, business leaders, and residents. Marcus felt a flicker of hope. These steps, while small, were critical in bridging the gap between the department and the people it served. The fallout for Officer Grayson. Later that afternoon, news broke that Officer Grayson had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The department's statement, while measured, acknowledged the public's concerns and pledged to take the matter seriously. The announcement sparked a fresh wave of media coverage, with pundits debating whether this was a genuine step toward reform or simply a calculated PR move. Meanwhile, Grayson's colleagues were divided. Some defended him, arguing that he was being scapegoated, while others distanced themselves, wary of being associated with his actions. For Grayson, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He had always operated with a sense of impunity, believing that the badge shielded him from consequences. Now, he faced the possibility of losing not just his job, but his reputation. Marcus's reflection. That evening, Marcus sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of files and legal briefs. The events of the past few days had been exhausting, but they had also reinforced his resolve. He opened his laptop and began drafting an op-ed for the local newspaper, titled A Call to Action, Reforming Our Police for a Better Future. In the piece, Marcus recounted his encounter with Grayson, framing it as a microcosm of the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. He called for unity, urging both the department and the community to come together to create meaningful change. This isn't about vilifying the police, he wrote. It's about holding ourselves to the standard we claim to uphold, to protect and serve. True accountability is not a punishment, it's a promise to do better. As he typed, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready. The reckoning had begun, and he intended to see it through to the end. Voices of change. The auditorium buzzed with an energy that was equal parts hope and frustration. Rows of plastic chairs filled with community members, activists, and off-duty police officers stretched to the back of the room. The city's first town hall meeting on police reform, spurred by Marcus Reynolds' recent experience, had drawn an overflowing crowd. People from all walks of life had come to share their stories, air grievances, and seek solutions. Marcus stood at the front of the room, flanked by Captain Elena Monroe and Chief Donovan Carter. A long table with microphones separated them from the crowd, but the symbolism of the gathering was clear. Tonight, there would be no separation between the community and those sworn to serve it. The first voices. The first speaker was an elderly woman with a cane, her voice steadied despite her obvious frailty. I've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years, she began, gripping the microphone tightly. I've seen good officers and bad ones, but lately, it feels like the bad ones are winning. My grandson was stopped 6 times in 1 month. 6 times. For walking home from his job. What are we supposed to tell our children? That they're suspects just for existing. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement and scattered applause. Marcus listened intently, jotting notes in a small notebook. This wasn't the first time he had heard such stories, but each one carried the weight of lived experience. He knew these voices were essential to his mission. Next came a middle-aged man in a construction uniform. I respect the police, he said, his voice tinged with emotion. I do. My brother's a cop in another city. But respect goes both ways. Last year, I called 911 because someone was breaking into my house. When the officers arrived, they questioned me like I was the criminal. It was humiliating. As the man sat down, a young woman with vibrant green hair took the mic. "I want to talk about solutions," she said, her tone sharp and determined. "We can't just keep airing grievances without demanding change. How about civilian oversight? How about making it easier to report misconduct without fear of retaliation? And how about hiring officers who actually live in the communities they serve?" The room erupted in applause, and Marcus couldn't help but nod. The woman's suggestions aligned closely with the reforms he had proposed, but hearing them echoed by a community member strengthened his resolve. Confrontation and reflection. Not everyone in the room was on board with the idea of reform. A uniformed officer, his arms crossed and his jaw tight, approached the microphone. "With all due respect," he began, his tone defensive, "you're painting us all with the same brush. Most of us are out there, every day putting our lives on the line. We're human. We make mistakes, but we're not villains." The room fell silent as the officer's words hung in the air. Marcus rose from his seat and approached the podium, his presence commanding but not confrontational. "Officer, I understand where you're coming from," he said, "and I want to make it clear that this isn't about demonizing the entire force. It's about accountability. Because when one officer abuses their power, it casts a shadow on all of you who are doing the job with integrity." The officer looked away, his expression softening slightly. Marcus continued, addressing the room as a whole. "Reform isn't about taking away your ability to do your job. It's about ensuring that job is done with fairness and respect, and that benefits everyone. Bridging the gap." As the evening wore on, the conversation began to shift from confrontation to collaboration. A young man who introduced himself as Jamal, the teenager who had recorded Marcus's encounter with Officer Grayson, stepped forward to speak. "I recorded that video because I was tired of seeing this stuff happen and nothing being done about it," Jamal said, his voice steady but filled with passion. "But for the first time, it feels like something might actually change. I just hope you guys keep listening." Marcus smiled at Jamal, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Jamal, your courage in documenting that moment is part of why we're here tonight. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It takes all of us working together. The plan takes shape." By the end of the night, Marcus had gathered a wealth of insights from the community. Their concerns, ideas, and personal stories painted a vivid picture of the challenges they faced and the solutions they envisioned. He knew these voices would be instrumental in refining his reform proposal. Back at his office, Marcus stayed late into the night, poring over his notes and drafting amendments to his plan. He included provisions for community policing initiatives. Officers would be required to spend time in the neighborhoods they patrolled, building relationships outside of enforcement contexts. Enhanced oversight mechanisms. A civilian review board would be established to handle complaints of misconduct, ensuring transparency and impartiality. Youth engagement programs. Partnerships with schools and community centers would aim to foster trust between young people and law enforcement. Mandatory accountability metrics. Departments would be required to track and publicly report data on stops, arrests, and use of force incidents, disaggregated by race and other demographic factors. Marcus emailed the revised plan to Chief Carter and Captain Monroe, attaching a note. "This is what they need. This is what we must deliver." Ripples of hope. The following morning, Marcus woke to an email from Chief Carter. "Marcus, the revisions are excellent. Let's move forward. I scheduled a press conference for tomorrow to announce our initial steps." Marcus's chest tightened with a mix of anxiety and determination. He knew the road ahead would be filled with resistance from various quarters. Officers entrenched in the old ways, union representatives wary of change, and political forces wary of rocking the boat. But he also knew the momentum was building. The town hall had lit a spark, and he intended to fan it into a flame. That afternoon, as he walked through the city streets, Marcus was stopped by a woman who had been at the meeting. She held her young daughter by the hand and looked at him with a mix of gratitude and hope. "Thank you for listening," she said. "It feels like we finally have someone on our side." Marcus crouched down to the little girl's level and smiled. "It's not just me," he said gently. "It's all of us, and we're going to make this city a better place for her." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unjust tears. As Marcus watched them walk away, he felt the weight of the responsibility he carried. But he also felt something else: hope. The voices of change were growing louder, and together they would be impossible to ignore. The resistance within. The next morning dawned bright and cold, a sharp contrast to the simmering tension within the police department. Marcus Reynolds arrived at headquarters to find the atmosphere unusually charged. Whispers followed him through the corridors, officers glancing his way with expressions that ranged from wary respect to thinly veiled hostility. The video of his encounter with Officer Grayson, coupled with the town hall meeting, had left a mark on the department, but not everyone viewed these events as a step toward progress. As Marcus entered the elevator, he was joined by Captain Elena Monroe. She carried a thick folder under her arm and wore a tight expression. "Morning, Marcus," she said, her tone clipped. "We've got a situation brewing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of situation?" Monroe glanced around to ensure they were alone. "The union is pushing back hard against the reforms. They're claiming the proposed oversight measures are an attack on their autonomy. There's also a faction of officers rallying behind Grayson, calling him a scapegoat. We're walking into a storm." Marcus sighed deeply, though he wasn't surprised. Change, especially at this scale, always met resistance. "Let's address it head-on. I've been through worse storms." The meeting of defiance. The situation came to a head in the precinct's largest conference room. At Monroe's insistence, Marcus had agreed to meet with the officers and union representatives to discuss their concerns. He walked into the room to find it packed, the air thick with tension. At the head of the room stood Sergeant John Harwood, a grizzled veteran with 25 years on the force and a reputation for rallying the rank and file. "Director Reynolds," Harwood began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. But I'll get straight to the point. These reforms you're proposing, especially the Civilian Oversight Board, are being seen as an attack on our integrity. You're asking us to do an already dangerous job under a microscope." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Sergeant Harwood, I understand your perspective, and I respect the work you and your officers do every day. But integrity isn't about avoiding scrutiny. It's about proving that scrutiny isn't necessary in the first place." Harwood's lips tightened. "With all due respect, sir, most of us do our jobs with honor. But these policies suggest we're all guilty until proven innocent." Marcus leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "This isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that when someone does violate the public's trust, there's a system in place to address it. And let's be honest, Sergeant, you've seen what happens when that system fails. It erodes trust, not just in the individual officer, but in the entire department." The room buzzed with murmurs, officers exchanging uncertain glances. Harwood crossed his arms. "And what about Officer Grayson? He's being hung out to dry because of one mistake." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. What happened with Grayson wasn't a mistake. It was a choice rooted in attitudes and behaviors that have no place in modern policing. And let me be clear, holding him accountable isn't about punishing him as an individual. It's about sending a message that we're serious about change. Voices of support. As the discussion continued, a surprising ally emerged. Officer Linda Patel, a relatively new recruit, stood up from the back of the room. Her voice was steady but firm as she addressed her colleagues. "I joined this department because I believe in protecting and serving the community," she said. "But I also seen things that made me question that belief. If these reforms can help rebuild trust and make us better officers, then why are we fighting them?" Harwood turned to her, his expression incredulous. "Patel, you've been here less than 2 years. You don't understand what it's like out there." I understand enough to know that change is necessary, Patel shot back. And if we're not willing to adapt, we're failing the very people we're supposed to protect. Her words hung in the air, drawing a smattering of nods from other officers. Marcus seized the moment. Officer Patel is right, he said. Change is hard, but it's also inevitable. The question is, will we lead that change, or will we resist it until it's forced upon us? Turning the tide. By the end of the meeting, the room's atmosphere had shifted. While not everyone was convinced, the seeds of understanding had been planted. Marcus left the precinct feeling cautiously optimistic, but he knew the battle was far from over. The union's resistance was a formidable obstacle, and the public's trust remained fragile. That evening, Marcus held a press conference to announce the department's first concrete steps toward reform. Flanked by Chief Carter and Captain Monroe, he outlined the establishment of the Civilian Oversight Board, the implementation of mandatory bias training, and the launch of a community policing pilot program. This is just the beginning, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the flashing cameras and buzzing reporters. We are committed to making this department a model of accountability and fairness, and we will not stop until that goal is achieved. The price of change. The backlash was swift. The union filed a formal complaint, accusing Marcus of overstepping his authority. Conservative commentators took to the airwaves, framing the reforms as anti-police, and on social media, a vocal minority launched a campaign to discredit Marcus, dredging up old cases in an attempt to paint him as biased. But there was also an outpouring of support. Community leaders praised the reforms, activists amplified the message, and ordinary citizens began sharing their own stories of interactions with law enforcement, both good and bad. Marcus received countless emails and letters, many of them thanking him for his courage. One letter, written in careful cursive, stood out. Dear Mr. Reynolds, I'm writing to thank you for what you're doing. My son was killed in an encounter with the police 5 years ago. Since then, I felt like no one was willing to hear our side of the story. But now, for the first time, it feels like someone is listening. Please don't stop fighting. Sincerely, Angela Carter. Marcus read the letter twice, his throat tightening. He kept it on his desk as a reminder of why he had chosen this path. A quiet victory. A week later, Marcus returned to the precinct for a follow-up meeting. This time, the mood was markedly different. Officers who had been openly hostile now seemed willing to listen, their questions less combative and more constructive. Harwood even approached Marcus afterward, his demeanor less confrontational. I still don't agree with everything you're doing, Harwood admitted. But I can see you're not just here to tear us down. Maybe there's a way forward after all. Marcus shook his hand, a small but meaningful victory. As the day ended, Marcus reflected on the progress that had been made. The resistance within the department was strong, but so was the growing coalition of officers and community members who believed in the possibility of change. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. And for Marcus, that was enough. A new dawn. The morning sunlight streamed through Marcus Reynolds' office window as he reviewed the final draft of the reform plan. Nearly every inch of his desk was covered in documents, reports, and community feedback. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the soft hum of his computer. Yet, outside the walls of the precinct and across the city, the air was alive with the momentum of change. The reforms were no longer just ideas scribbled on paper. They had evolved into concrete initiatives supported by community leaders, elected officials, and even a growing number of officers within the department. Still, Marcus knew that the true test of their impact would come in the weeks and months ahead. The battle wasn't over. It had merely shifted into a new phase. The first signs of progress. Marcus glanced at the calendar on his desk. Today marked the launch of the Community Partnership Initiative, CPI, one of the cornerstones of his reform plan. The program paired officers with neighborhood leaders to foster relationships and address local concerns collaboratively. It was an ambitious project, but one Marcus believed could serve as a model for other cities grappling with similar challenges. He arrived at the launch event early, held at a local community center in the same neighborhood where Officer Grayson had stopped him. The building was abuzz with activity. Volunteers set up tables with informational pamphlets, while local vendors provided refreshments. Children played on the center's playground, their laughter a hopeful soundtrack to the day. As Marcus entered the main hall, he was greeted by Jamal, the teenager who had recorded the video that catalyzed the reforms. Jamal had become an unlikely spokesperson for the movement, his video garnering millions of views and sparking national conversations about policing and accountability. "Mr. Reynolds," Jamal called, jogging over with a wide grin. "You ready for this?" Marcus chuckled. "As ready as I'll ever be. How about you? You've been busy these past few weeks." Jamal shrugged modestly. "Just trying to do my part. My mom says I've been spending more time on this than my schoolwork." "Well," Marcus said, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder, "what you're doing matters. Don't underestimate the impact you've had." A moment of reckoning for Officer Grayson. The crowd quieted as Marcus took the stage to speak, his presence commanding attention. He began by acknowledging the challenges that had brought them to this moment, emphasizing the collective effort required to move forward. As he spoke, his eyes scanned the audience and landed on a surprising figure, Officer Grayson, standing near the back, his face a mix of discomfort and curiosity. After the event, Grayson approached Marcus hesitantly. "Director Reynolds," he began, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you said. I started taking one of those bias training courses on my own time." Marcus was taken aback, but maintained his composure. "That's a good start, Officer Grayson. The real question is, what will you do with what you learn?" Grayson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not expecting forgiveness or anything. I just want to do better." Marcus extended his hand. "Then do better, Grayson. Actions speak louder than words." Grayson shook his hand, a small gesture that felt like the first crack in a wall of resistance. The media spotlight. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat for an interview with a prominent national journalist. The interview was live, and Marcus knew it was a critical opportunity to explain the reform plan to a broader audience. "Director Reynolds," the journalist began, "your experience with Officer Grayson has become a flashpoint in the national conversation about policing. Some have hailed you as a hero, while others have criticized your approach. How do you respond to your critics?" Marcus leaned forward, his tone measured. "I don't see myself as a hero. I'm just someone trying to fix a system that's been broken for too long. As for the critics, change is never easy. It's uncomfortable, and it challenges people to confront hard truths. But discomfort is necessary for growth." The journalist nodded. "What do you say to those who argue that your reforms go too far?" "I say this. Accountability isn't an attack on law enforcement. It's a commitment to its integrity. If we can't hold ourselves to the highest standards, how can we expect the public to trust us?" The journalist paused, then asked, "Do you believe the reforms you've implemented here could serve as a model for other cities?" Marcus smiled faintly. "I hope so. But more importantly, I hope they show that change is possible when people work together, when communities and law enforcement see themselves as partners, not adversaries. The impact takes root." Over the next few weeks, the early signs of progress began to emerge. Complaints of misconduct dropped significantly in the precincts participating in the CPI program. Officers reported feeling more connected to the communities they served, and residents expressed cautious optimism about the department's new direction. At a town hall meeting, a single mother stood up to speak. "I used to tell my kids to avoid the police at all costs," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But now I see officers walking the streets, talking to people, playing basketball with the kids. It's a small thing, but it gives me hope." Even Jamal, who had been skeptical of the department's intentions, acknowledged the changes. "It's not perfect," he admitted in an interview. But it's a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. A legacy in the making. One evening, Marcus received a letter from the city's mayor. It was an invitation to speak at a national policing conference, where he would share his experiences and insights with leaders from across the country. The invitation was both an honor and a responsibility, a testament to the impact of his work. As Marcus prepared his speech, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the young boy he had been, stopped by police for playing basketball in the park. He thought about the countless individuals whose stories had fueled his fight for justice. And he thought about the future, a future where encounters like his with Officer Grayson would become relics of the past. On the day of the conference, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium. As he spoke, his voice steady and resolute, he knew that the work was far from over. But he also knew that they were on the right path. "This isn't just about reforming a system," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust, restoring dignity, and redefining what it means to protect and serve. And together, I believe we can make that vision a reality, the dawn of a new era." As Marcus returned home that night, he sat on his porch and looked out at the city skyline. The challenges ahead were daunting, but the progress they had made was undeniable. For the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of hope. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. A new dawn was on the horizon, not just for Marcus, but for the city he loved and the people he served. And as the stars began to appear, Marcus made a silent promise to himself to keep fighting, no matter how long it took, until justice was not just an ideal, but a reality for all. The ripple effect. As Marcus sat on his porch that evening, his thoughts lingered on the past few months. Every conversation, every meeting, every confrontation had brought him closer to a vision of justice that felt almost tangible now. He thought about Angela Carter's letter, Jamal's courage, Officer Patel's bravery, and even Officer Grayson's tentative steps towards self-reflection. These moments weren't just anecdotes. They were pieces of a larger mosaic, a testament to the possibility of transformation. A call from the mayor. His phone buzzed on the small table beside him. It was a call from the mayor. "Marcus," the mayor began, his tone warm yet formal. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you've accomplished. The reforms are already showing results, and the public's confidence in the department is starting to rebuild. It's slow, but it's real." "Thank you, Mayor," Marcus replied. "But this isn't about me. It's about the people, the community, and the officers who are willing to embrace change." "Well, it's also about leadership," the mayor said, "which brings me to why I'm calling. I've spoken with Chief Carter, and we both agree. It's time for you to step into an even bigger role. We'd like to appoint you as Deputy Commissioner for Police Accountability." Marcus's breath caught. The position was newly created, a direct result of the reform initiatives. It would give him greater influence over the department's policies and practices, ensuring the changes he had championed would endure. "I'm honored," Marcus said after a moment, "but I need to think about it." "Of course," the mayor replied. "Take your time, but not too much. We need you." Closure with Officer Grayson. The next day, Marcus made a quiet decision to visit Officer Grayson. He called Captain Monroe for the address, and soon found himself in front of a modest suburban home. Grayson opened the door, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Director Reynolds," Grayson said, stepping aside. "This is unexpected." Marcus entered and took a seat in the small living room. "I wanted to talk, Grayson. Not as your superior, but as a man who's seen both sides of the badge." Grayson looked uneasy but nodded. "Go ahead." "You said you've started taking bias training," Marcus began. "But have you thought about why that incident happened? Why you stopped me that day?" Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "I've been thinking about it a lot. I guess I let my assumptions take over. I didn't stop to question them. And I didn't think about the harm I could cause." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "That's a start. But understanding isn't enough. You have to act on it. It's not just about changing your mindset. It's about changing the system that fosters those assumptions. Grayson nodded slowly. I'm willing to try. I know I've got a long way to go, but I don't want to be the kind of officer people fear. Marcus stood and extended his hand. Then do the work, Grayson. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's worth it. As they shook hands, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Grayson might not change overnight, but he had taken the first step, a small but significant victory. A moment of reflection. That evening, Marcus sat in his office, staring at the framed photographs lining his shelves. There were pictures of his family, snapshots of his early days as a rookie officer, and awards recognizing his contributions to law enforcement. But the item that caught his eye was a simple thank you note from Angela Carter, written after their first in-person meeting. He thought about the lives touched by his work, not just the ones captured in those photos, but the countless others he would never meet. The ripple effect of his reforms would extend far beyond his tenure, shaping the culture of the department and the lives of those it served. The ceremony. A week later, Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall, flanked by the mayor, Chief Carter, and Captain Monroe. Before him, a crowd of community members, officers and media had gathered for the announcement of his new role as Deputy Commissioner for Police Accountability. The mayor began the ceremony, praising Marcus's tireless efforts and unwavering dedication. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he approached the podium with a sense of purpose. "This moment isn't about me," Marcus said, his voice clear and resolute. "It's about all of us, every officer who wears the badge with honor, every community member who demands justice, and every individual who believes in the possibility of a better future." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Change isn't easy. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it takes time. But it's also necessary. Today, we take another step forward together. And while there's still work to be done, I know this, we're building something that will last. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus stepped back, feeling a wave of both relief and determination. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a legacy of hope. As Marcus left the ceremony, he found himself walking through the same neighborhood where his life had changed just months earlier. Children played in the streets, their laughter filling the air. Officers patrolled on foot, stopping to chat with residents. The tension that had once permeated the area seemed to have eased, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of trust. He stopped at a corner and looked around, taking it all in. This was the city he had always dreamed of, a city where justice and community were not in opposition, but in harmony. Marcus smiled, his heart full of hope. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for now, he allowed himself to savor the progress they had made. The road was long, but with each step, they were building a brighter future. And for Marcus Reynolds, that was more than enough.